Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mark Isselhart. I'm the Maple Specialist for UVM Extension, and I'm pleased to be with you this evening. A couple of housekeeping things. This program is part of a larger webinar series put on by UVM Extension and other cooperators, and we're happy to have you. We are recording it, so if you know of someone who isn't able to attend and would like to, we can certainly point you to that recording when it's posted. And we also, for people who are here but would like a little extra accessibility, we have live captioning available. And Ashley, our captioner, is going to post a link in the chat. So if you go over to the chat, if you're looking for that resource, you can click on it and you'll be able to see the live captioning. Everyone's going to be muted for now, and we will certainly take time at the end for questions. And we are excited to have you, and we'll cover a bunch of stuff. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We did receive some from the initial registration, so we'll try to get to those at the end. And if things come up during the presentation, jot them down and either put them in the chat or ask them live when we get there. So like I said, this is part of a larger webinar series. We've already had 3 presentations so far, some good ones on rental rates, establishing rental rates in sugar bushes, one on sustainability of tapping, and one on sugar bush leases. The next round, the next presentation will be on the 30th about fall tapping and tap hole longevity. And as you can see here, there are presentations slated all the way up into December. So make sure to check it out and participate. There's a lot of resources available at maplemanager.org, including, like I said, the slides for past presentations, and there will be recordings up shortly. There's also information from a variety of different sources on this website, so I recommend you check that out for more information. And certainly any of the presenters that we've had so far would welcome questions if it occurs to you after the fact. So reach out to this group. You can ask the team on this maplemanager.org, and we'll get you the best answers we can. So I guess to start, I would say we're looking at a tap hole, and when you're tapping as a producer, you stay at that tree relatively briefly. You make a hole during the tapping season, and you may get a little information, you may not, but typically the name of the game in tapping is get as many taps in a day as you can. So there's not a whole lot to be learned in the moment. There's a lot of pressure to keep going. But what I think we're going to hit home with this presentation is that moment in time when you're at each individual crop tree and you're tapping them, there can be some really critical information and things happening at that moment that will dictate your success or failure or lack of productivity throughout the season, and it's important to pay attention to. And really what I'm talking about is, what do you see when you make that tap hole? Do you see something like on the left where you see some nice, clean, functional wood coming out of the tap hole, or do you see something that's not so good, something like what you see on the right? Intuitively, most producers know that the chips on the left are going to represent a good tap hole, and the ones on the right, there's some concern there. And certainly when we used buckets, we had a lot better understanding of what each individual tap hole produced in terms of sap. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of tubing systems is that we lose that individual tree understanding of how much sap is being produced by any given tree. And it is important for overall yield, for sure. So typically, when you're drilling a tree, you're not going to see either or. It's going to be mostly white. Perhaps you'll see a little bit of brown, but in general, most people aren't going to see all brown. If they do, hopefully the person doing the tapping is going to look up and try to figure out what went wrong. but let's keep going. So one of the things, this is an older picture, one of the reasons why you might end up seeing a lot of brown chips is if you see a tubing system that has some flaws to it. So here we see a large diameter tree, and if you're following some older tapping guidelines, you might think that this is an appropriate tree for 3 taps. Unfortunately, this is an old tubing system. You've got very short drop lines, 7/16 spouts, and it would look from the outside that a lot of those tap holes are clustered on one side of the tree, and those are all recipes for building up too much brown wood. But let's get into a little bit about what producers can do to mitigate that, and the understanding of how many taps you put in a tree and the things that you can do when you're designing your tubing system or maintaining it over the long term can go a long way into reducing the risk of hitting brown wood. Dr. Abby Vandenberg has done some interesting work, some really helpful work trying to understand what are the variables that we can control that would prevent hitting brown wood. And that was part of some work that Abby did developing a mathematical model related to our larger project of sustainable tapping guidelines. And through that mathematical model, she had to understand all the variables of what may lead a particular tap hole to hit stained wood versus not stained wood. And here you see a pretty long list of factors, some of which are directly in control by the producer. And by that, I mean drop line length, or the size of your tapping bit, or how many taps you put in a tree. Those are things you can control directly as a producer. Other things are a little more indirect, things like tree growth. That's something you can control, and we'll talk about it, but it's more of an indirect factor. And then there's things that are largely out of the producer's control, which have more to do with the physiology of the tree. So I think what we're going to do now is we're going to focus a little bit more on what's going on underneath that bark, the stuff you really can't see from the outside, to better understand how that tree develops these areas of brown wood. I think one of the most important things to remember is that compartmentalization is a natural process. Now, compartmentalization is the tree's natural defense from decay. And here we're looking at the cut end of a sugar maple stem that's been tapped for many years. And those small brown stains or discolorations around the stem are old tap holes, scars from old tap holes. The tap was either above or below that location. And it's a natural process the tree undergoes. It's an active process. The tree, in other words, the tree uses energy that it has stored to devote to producing this staining column. And that's really designed to prevent the whole tree from getting infected and becoming decayed as a result of some wound. Not just tapping, a tree does compartmentalization. Anytime someone runs into a tree with something, or a branch breaks off in a windstorm, it's a natural process. So some of the underlying factors and causes and processes of compartmentalization were really put together by a man named Alex Shigo, and he was a research forester with the United States Forest Service, and he developed this concept of compartmentalization in trees and tried to formalize it a little bit. And this is an illustration. It's a cartoon, if you will. It does not represent truly how the anatomy works in a tree, but it does help to understand how Shigo developed this model. And as you can see, this is a simplified version of a tree stem that are divided up into segments. And the numbers that you see represent the various locations where walls, and by wall I mean a chemical barrier and in some cases a physical barrier, are developed to prevent infection. And the perimeter of that wall ends up being the sort of the extent of that staining area that we see at least in our case, talking about tapping, but if you had a damage from a windstorm or something, the process is very similar. What's important to remember about this slide and this illustration is that the numbers represent the strength of the wall. In other words, the lower the number, the weaker the wall is in the tree's capacity to shut down infection. So if you look at wall one is being described as those the cut surface, the cut stem of the tree, and really we're focused on what's called xylem vessels. Those are the water conducting cells that allow a tree to pump massive amounts of water from the ground up through the leaves during the growing season. Trees have amazing capacity to move water throughout the stem from the roots up through the leaves. And that capacity has a lot to do with these xylem vessels. They're just very well engineered to do that. They're so good, in fact, that it makes it harder when a tree is wounded. It makes it a little bit harder for the tree to wall that part of the tissue off because it's so good and so designed to move water. So wall one becomes a little bit weaker, or is a little bit weaker. Wall two is actually the growth that happens later in the growing season. So in trees, if you're familiar at all with tree growth, you have early wood, which is the growth that happens in the spring and early summer. And then as that growth starts to taper off, those cells, those new wood cells tend to get thicker and harder and a little bit smaller and tighter. And those are, in fact, a little bit better barrier to infection than wall one. Wall three is represented in this diagram as a stone wall. It's it's actually not that. It's the ray cells, and ray cells are another type of cell within a tree. They're actually the storage compartment for the tree's stored energy or non-structural carbohydrates. A lot of folks believe that energy is stored in the roots, and that's true. There's a lot of stored carbohydrates in the roots, but there are ray cells throughout the tree, and there's a lot of non-structural carbohydrates stored throughout the stem, in the large branches and the fine branches and twigs. And what's important to remember is that these ray cells intersect with the xylem cells in this sort of radiating pattern, and they actually make a little bit better barrier than the first two walls. The last barrier is actually, and it isn't illustrated on this, but it's wall four. It's actually the new growth. So assuming a wound took place at some moment in time, the next year when growth is taking place will be the strongest wall. So if you have multiple years of growth, that barrier between the year when the injury took place and the year after, that is wall four. Another way to look at it, here's another illustration, is kind of looking at it from the side. And if you look on the right, you see a illustration of a stem of a tree looking up and down. And you can see that the various walls are represented. And you can see that wall one, being the weakest, the staining extends much more above and below than side to side. Those cookies you see represented next to the stem, you can see as you go further and further away from that point of injury, the smaller and smaller that stain becomes. And I hope you can also see that the barrier between where the drill hole was made and the growth afterwards, there's really no staining whatsoever in the years following, and that represents year four. So what does this mean in terms of sugaring and tapping and whether or not you're going to hit stained wood? Well, tapping generates some of this stained wood or non-conductive wood, and those non-conductive areas are permanently removed from the tree's circulatory system. In other words, the tree invests energy and time in walling off that tissue so that it won't be infected. It just also means that sap won't go through there anymore. So the number of areas of stain, of compartmentalized wood, is represented essentially by the tapping intensity. How many taps you put in a tree will dictate how much is accumulated. And then there's also this factor that trees are growing. They're accumulating new fresh wood every year, and so that adds conductive wood. One way of looking at sustainability is that you are removing less wood through tapping than is being accumulated through a tree's natural process of growth. That's one way of looking at it. So it might get a little abstract with these drawings, but I think it's worth looking at the real thing and not look at illustrations. This is a microscopic image of a slice of sugar maple wood. And imagine, if you will, you're looking straight down on the cut surface of a stem, nice fresh wood. These white circles, these relatively large white circles that you see, those are the cut ends of those xylem vessels. That is what's pumping that water up through the ground, through the leaves during the growing season. It's also, incidentally, what we're cutting into with our nice, sharp tapping bit and trying to collect sap from. So we're drilling into those and we're severing them. The more pale yellow cells you see surrounding those large vessels, those are the fibers. That's what makes a tree strong. It's what gives it its tremendous ability to grow tall and withstand wind and endure in a really harsh environment of the woods. So the sap does not go through those fibers, even though they look hollow and they look porous, but sap is really only running through those xylem vessels. And like I said in the earlier drawing, that wall 1 is made up of those xylem vessels. So that's where those walls form. So that's where wall 1 is. Wall 2, if you remember, is the late wood. So if you see down at the bottom, you see the relatively smaller and tighter cells of the late wood. That's wall 2. Wall 3, if we zoom out a little bit, now here's something that's probably a little bit more familiar looking. This is the picture of a cut sugar maple stem directly through an old tap hole. And that tree was tapped several years previous. In fact, it was about 5 years before before this tree was cut down. So you see there's some new growth on top of the old tap hole. But wall 3, if you remember, is made up of those ray cells, those energy storing cells that radiate out from the center of the tree. And this is where wall 3 forms. And you can see right away that those are really good at keeping in that staining, that infection. There's really not that much spread side to side from a tap hole. And lastly, wall 4, which is the strongest wall, that occurs at that barrier between the time at which the wound took place and the year following that growth. So here you can see on that red dotted line that that's the barrier between where the tree was when it was wounded and then any growth subsequent. So you can see there's really no staining that extends into that new wood. Just a side note, and something I think is kind of interesting to think about. One, you see that there's tremendous growth right around that tap hole, that bulge you see of wood. That's not that typical of the growth rate of that tree around the rest of the stem. It's really just around that point of the wounding. That's called callus tissue, and it's a special response to an open wound. So you can't expect to have that much growth around the whole tree. And in fact, if you look off to the side, you'll see that the growth rings start to taper off to a much more typical width. The other thing that's important to look at is if you look inside that tap hole right there, you can see the tree has actually started to produce new bark, even though that is buried within the old tap hole. And I think what this really hits home is that there's a barrier inside the tree. There's a barrier to what's inside the tree and what's outside the tree. And even though you have a tap hole that's buried inside a tree and you can't really see it from the outside, that inside hollow is still considered on the outside of that tree. From the tree's perspective, it is outside of it. This is probably a picture that you're a little bit more familiar with if you've ever cut up a stained tree or a tree that had previously been tapped. And this shows a little bit about the extent of how that staining occurs. Again, wall 1 is relatively weak, and so it takes the tree quite a bit to shut that system down. That's why you see that staining extending above and below the tap hole quite a bit. These, incidentally, these holes are made with a 7/16 inch diameter bit, a little bit more traditional diameter, and that's not at all typical in today's sugaring. But what's important is if all those walls that I talked about, 1 through 4, if they were all equal strength, if you will, at stopping infection, instead of having this long skinny stain, you'd see almost like a perfect sphere of stain going in all directions. But through the tree's physiology, we know that that's just not the case. So we had this question of how much sap do you get when you actually hit stained wood? You know, intuitively, I think most people understand that you're going to get less, but how much less? And what are the extremes? How little would you get, or how much could you get even if you do hit stained wood? So we asked this question and went about trying to try to answer it. So a fairly modest study, we looked at some trees that had some history of tapping, but we made new tap holes. In this experiment, we used 3/16 brand new lines, 1 tap per tree, and 1 tree per 3/16 lines. We did set them up to have a natural vacuum, so there was a enhanced production as a result of that natural vacuum. We broke those 20 trees into 2 different treatments. We had a control treatment, if you will, tapped normally and avoiding obvious old tap holes. And then 10 we tapped directly above a previous tap hole. And really here, what we're trying to do is to intentionally hit brown wood and see what the effects are. The information we're gathering for the most part is total sap production and sap sweetness on an individual tree basis, and then taking an average of each of those, and followed this for 2 different years, 2018 to 2019. Additionally, we looked at the volume of stained wood, and you'll see how that factored in a minute. So this is an example of one of the trees drilled in what I would call the stained wood. So we tapped directly an inch above the previous tap hole. Standard practice, 5/16 tap holes drilled 1.5 inches deep. And one interesting thing, you know, science will bring up, you know, you think you know the outcome, and you end up getting a slightly different outcome. And this was no different. 3 out of the 10 tap holes in 2008 tapped directly above an old tap hole indicated no stained wood whatsoever, which was a pretty unexpected finding right off the bat. And you know, I think what it goes to show is that we oftentimes think about trees as perfect cylinders, and that the xylem wood and the vessels all are oriented perfectly vertically, and there's no blemishes whatsoever. And in fact, in reality, trees are not like that. Trees are made up of old branch stubs and old wounds and you know, windstorms and things that cause the grain of wood to be something other than perfectly straight. And anyone who's on the call or on the webinar who's a woodworker will certainly attest to the fact that not all wood is perfectly straight and true. So here's an example of what we were looking at. This is not one of the trees that we cut down or didn't cut the tree down to look at it, but just an example of what we were doing when we were tapping into these trees. So here's an example looking at the side of an old tap hole that has some growth over it. And you've got this area of stained or non-conductive wood. It's covered up by new growth. Remember, wall 4, that the strongest barrier for infection is between the old wood and the wood that's grown after whenever that injury took place. So this tree has a little bit of conductive wood, and then there's some bark as well. Now, in order to disentangle how much of which type of wood there was, we had to collect all those wood chips, and that made for some pretty funny field work, as you might imagine. I had a modified plastic bin strapped around me, and it was directly underneath the drill I was using to make these holes. But I caught all the chips and I put them all together into individual vials for each tree, and then took them back to the lab for processing. And here, that is an example of one of the trees cut into, drilled into clean wood. And here's one that was intercepted some clean wood and some non-conductive wood. And you can imagine that even on a microscopic level, there's a little bit of each. So here's an example of even just one chip that came out of the tap hole and had a little bit of conductive wood, and the rest was largely non-conductive. So had to spend some time at a microscope and separate these out. A bit of a painstaking process, as you can imagine. But then once it's sorted, we have clear piles of different amounts of tissue for each tap hole. So here's an example of a conductive wood one, and here's an example of one that has mostly stained wood, a little bit of conductive wood, and then the bark, of course, is separated out as well. So the results of this work were quite telling, and we'll get right into it now. In terms of sap yield, there was a dramatic decrease in sap production. Now, again, these are average values for those 10 trees on trees that were intentionally wounded into non-conductive wood, and trees that were hit clean wood. And there was some variability for sure. It wasn't a guarantee that you were going to hit 100% non-conductive wood. In that first year, we saw a 75% decrease on average as a result of hitting that stained wood. Now, obviously, you would hope that most people tapping are not going to tap directly 1 inch above an old tap hole. So that's a fairly extreme example, but necessary if we wanted to make sure we could quantify how much stained wood was being intercepted. So that's 2018, and we repeated the experiment again in 2019. Still dramatic drop-off, not quite as large as 2018. There was roughly a 70% reduction in sap yield as a result of hitting that stained wood compared to the clean wood. Another question is, well, okay, if you hit stained wood, is the sap the same, or is it also impacted somehow? Is it not just total volume reduction, but is there somehow a reduction in the sap sweetness of the sap coming out of the tree? 2018, we found no difference. The sap that we were able to collect out of those trees that intercepted non-conductive wood, but also had a little bit of conductive wood. Remember, there was a bit of growth on top of the old tap holes, so there was some sap getting out. There was no difference in sap sweetness, and that was true in 2018 and 2019. So I think what that says is that if you do intercept some conductive wood, but mostly non-conductive wood, you really won't see a big decrease or impact on sap sweetness. So when you put those things together, you put the sap sweetness results and the total volume of sap together, we wanted to understand what's the relationship to how much non-conductive wood. Because if you remember, I did separate out the area of non-conductive wood from conductive wood, and it wasn't all the same amount. Some trees had more, some tap holes had more conductive wood than others. So you combine that and you end up with a graph that looks like this. Now this is 2 years worth of data. This is 2018 and 19, but the relationship held up between those 2 years. And it stands to reason that the more stained wood that you intercept with your tap hole, the less sap you're going to get And since we know the sap sweetness isn't impacted, that the total yield of syrup is going to be reduced as well. So largely, it's essentially a one-to-one relationship, that the more staining you intercept, the less sap you're going to produce. Now, following tapping, we are also curious about tap hole closure. Is there something inherent about hitting directly into a stained wood that would impact the tree's natural ability to close off that tap hole? So went back and remeasured some of these tap holes after the treatment of being into clean wood or some of the more non-conductive tap holes. Interestingly enough, the tap hole closure was very similar between those two treatments. More variability in the non-conductive wood treatment, but they still had similar rates of tap hole closure. This is in the year following the initial treatment, so after a full year's growth. So how much of an issue is this in the real world? We just went through a process of telling you that we tap directly above an old tap hole where you would expect to hit it. But in practice, in most operations, or in operations that we have communicated with, how often does this really happen? So we do have some data. We had a survey of producers, not just in Vermont, but across the Northeast and a bit in the Midwest. And we had operations of varying sizes, everything from, I would say, a hobby operation with one tap all the way up to very large with 100,000 taps. And on average, they saw about 4.5% rate of hitting brown wood. Now, that is, depending on your perspective, that might seem like a lot or a little, but that's sort of what we had as an average. The range, however, was dramatically larger than that. We had quite a few people say that they never hit brown wood, and we even had individuals as high as 41%. So there is quite a bit of variability, and that is reflected in those error bars you see on the right, with producers reporting what percent of their tap holes had brown wood. That's not to say how much brown wood, that's just how much brown wood did they hit. But if you look a little bit deeper and ask and find out how much they're intercepting, it also gets kind of an interesting part of the story. So here we divided it up by what percent of the time they see. So almost a quarter of the producers say that they never hit brown wood whatsoever, or stained wood. The vast, much larger amount, 44% of the producers say they hit somewhere between 1% and 4% of the time. About 18% said that they hit it somewhere between 5% and 9%, and then 14% are 10% or greater. And I think we're going to hopefully point out how important that is to your overall production. Now, you're not going to see it on an individual tree basis. If you remember, you're not going to see that reduction. That reduction is going to be averaged over your whole production, and you'll just be a little bit lower. And but it can be significant. Tim Perkins put together this graph, and this illustrates what was happening at Proctor. So we were at right around that 4.5% rate. Now, if you use a bulk value of raw sap at about 50 cents a gallon, and you say you hit stained wood about 4.5% of the time, we calculate that to be about 30 cents per tap across your whole operation is being given up in terms of losses. We went through a process of reducing the number of taps per tree, of really being careful about tap hole location, and modifying a few other parts of the operation, and really tried to get that number down. And as you can see, we've been largely successful in reducing that amount to the point now where we are less than 0.5% hitting stained wood. So it certainly is possible, and there's a real economics incentive to do that. So I think the conclusions are fairly clear that hitting non-conductive wood can really impact your yield, and that the reduction is largely proportional to the amount that you hit. It's hard to know. No one is going to take a plastic bucket and collect the chips and segment out the individual chips on a several hundred or several thousand tap operation. But I think the point is clear that the more brown you hit, the less sap you're going to get, and that paying attention to the incidence of hitting brown wood is important. And we also found that sap sweetness is not impacted, and that tap hole closure was largely not impacted as well. Now, what are some things that you can do as producers to mitigate or reduce the likelihood that you are going to run into stained wood? Well, one of the things is to add more wood each year. And to do that, you want careful management. You want to make sure that your crop trees have ample room to grow. Now, you can't guarantee that they're going to have a good growing season, that they're going to have just the right amount of temperature and water, but you can make sure that that competition for sunlight is just the right balance. Now, what I want to say about careful management is that with thinning, a little is good, a lot is not necessarily better. So if you're going into an area that has a level of stocking that is high and that growth may be impacted, it's important that you consider your forest management plan, and we would certainly recommend that you work with a professional forester to develop a management plan. That management plan is going to do a few things. One, it's going to inventory what you have on the ground, and it's going to incorporate the goals you have, presumably as a producer or a landowner, moving forward. So if your number one goal for that particular parcel is to produce as much sap as you can safely and carefully, then you're going to have a strategy for thinning that does not necessarily involve thinning around every single crop tree at one time. It may be an incremental process, because sugar maples, among other species, but sugar maples especially, can be sensitive to over thinning, and there can be residual damage and some unintended consequences. So careful management is very important, and I would expect that a trained forester can help you understand the process whereby you do that thinning. Take the extra time when tapping. There's definitely a feeling of go, go, go when you're tapping. You're under the gun. There's only so many days of sap flow, and we certainly understand that. But you can also see that making mistakes or taking the time to avoid as best you can wounds and old tap holes are going to pay off over your whole operation by reducing the amount of stained wood that you're going to hit. Try to keep track of how many times you do hit stained wood. So it could be as simple as a little tally sheet, maybe a little notebook or something that people are keeping with them, and just keeping a check mark of how many times they hit stained wood. They don't necessarily have to calculate what percentage it was of brown and not brown, but it can really help identify, do you really have a problem? Are you creeping towards 10%? If you're up that high, you would really need to think about what's causing it. Is it a lack of growth in your crop trees? Is it poor tapping? Is your tubing system designed in a way that is causing you to hit stained wood more often? You go back to one of those earlier slides where you had a 3-tap tree in terms of diameter, but all those 3 small drop lines were clustered in one area. The likelihood of hitting stained wood is really increased when you have a system like that. So another strategy, another recommendation is expanding the tapping zone. Historically, we've always thought about tapping above the lateral line, making sure that you're reaching high and around the tree. Well, tapping below the lateral line, we've done work on that and found that there really is no difference in production as a result of tapping below. So by doing that, you expose a much larger area of that conductive tissue, and presumably areas that have never been tapped before. And as long as there isn't some residual damage from poor logging work or some other damage, you should have nice clean wood to utilize. Shallower tap holes, not going quite as deep, can also help. Smaller diameter spouts can help. Reducing the number of taps per tree, and certainly increasing the length of drops. You know, we would recommend a minimum 30 inches for your drop line, if not 36, because it just allows you to utilize more of that tapping band. One other thing I'll say is when you're retubing and you're doing new lateral lines, it's human nature to kind of replace exactly what you had. And it's often the case that each T that you have on a given crop tree is going to be on one side of the tree. Well, if you always retube and keep that T on the same side, it's likely that you're going to be tapping heavily on that side of the tree. So when you're retubing, consider swapping the side of the tree where that T is up against the tree, and that can help, again, spread that tapping intensity over more of the stem. So we've covered quite a bit, and some of it was a little bit more on the tree physiology side of things. We do have some relatively short videos that talk about some of these topics, and they're part of a YouTube channel that is hosted by the Proctor Maple Research Center. So I would urge you to go to that channel, check out the playlist, Keys to High Sap Yields, and we have 10 videos up there, and not just on compartmentalization or tapping into stained wood, but there's lots of other topics that are worth checking out. And they essentially summarize what we went over today. So check it out, and if you have further questions, you're certainly welcome to get a hold of us with those. So with that, I think we're doing pretty good with time. It's 7:45, at least on my clock. So I'd be happy to take some questions. I know there was a few in the chat when we asked you to enter stuff in your registration, and maybe we'll go from there. So let me look in the chat first. So, Tom, do you want to pull up a couple of questions, the ones that we got from the registration first, and I'll go through those?
Sure. Do you just want me to read them off?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So the first one is the person who wrote the question is located in New Jersey and typically places taps in late January. And they ask, if I tapped in November or December, how long should I expect the tap to produce?
Well, that's a good question. We don't have a lot of data on sap production in that particular climate, but a lot of it will depend on what the warm temperatures, what happens during that period between when you tap and when you actually get sap flow. You have a truly dormant tree. If you have really hot temperatures, something really abnormal, you might run into an issue with some bacterial or microbial growth. But if you consistently, in your area of New Jersey, consistently have cold temperatures, it probably won't be as much of an issue. I guess I'm wondering too if that participant is wondering if they feel like they're missing out on yield, or when they're seeing the sap flow season end on the tail end. It can certainly be that the season would end earlier in that southern location. So, what's the second question?
The second question asks about best practices for line maintenance and for cleaning of lines, and vacuum pressure affecting sap yields.
So maintenance, I think I talked a little bit about when you retube, you want to make sure that you're doing your best to space out where that tapping takes place. There's a lot of work that I couldn't possibly summarize in just this short amount of time about sanitation. There are people who have had success doing very little sanitation after the tubing season, just essentially running their vacuum and getting as much sap out as possible. Others are do quite a bit of work with pumping in a sanitizing solution and then removing it. I would urge that person to get a hold of us, and we can point them in the direction of a tremendous amount of information that has come out of UVM as well as Cornell on the subject of sanitation. The last part of his question was about vacuum level. It's a very linear relationship. We know that pretty clearly, that the more vacuum you get, the higher the vacuum, the more sap you're going to get. It's about 5 to 7% for every inch of vacuum that you generate. And that relationship has been found not just with work at UVM, but other places like Center Acer. So it's a fairly linear relationship there. There is no evidence that we've seen in our work to indicate that there's more staining or more compartmentalization as a result of higher vacuum. Of course, some of that work was done before people went to these very high levels. So it could be potentially that there's an issue at the very highest levels of vacuum, but we just don't have data to suggest that. And was there one more before I get to the chat?
Yep. And, I also just wanted to let people know too that if they'd prefer to ask the question, they should be able to unmute themselves if they want to just use the microphone. But the last one that was sent in is 9 inches really big enough to start tapping and not hit stained wood in the future?
So I'm assuming that they're asking about 9 inches in diameter, and it would largely depend on what sort of tapping practices they're following and the growth rates especially. Growth rates are going to make a huge difference. So I guess it'll probably come down to a it depends sort of answer. You know, not all 9-inch trees are growing gangbusters. Some of them have been suppressed and in the subdominant or suppressed position for years, and it would definitely not be a good practice to be tapping those. So without really understanding what your growth rates are, it's hard to really answer that question for any given tree. There's certainly trees where the tree is really on its upswing in terms of growth rate at that diameter, and it should be fine. But without knowing the growth rates, it's really hard to say. And I would say that that's another reason to consider having a professional forester keep at least an eye or help you understand how to assess growth rate over time in your crop trees. Remember, we're investing a lot of time and a lot of money on these trees, and we're holding them for a long time, much longer than you would keep a tree for if you were growing it for timber production. So it's best to really understand where they're at and where that stand is in terms of its development. That's a good question. Okay, so now it looks like question from Bert, who says, question on expanding the tapping zone. What are your suggestions? Longer drops, tapping below the lateral, other. I think we covered that for the most part. I think certainly longer drops are going to help. And not only having longer drops, but maximizing it. Really discipline yourself or the people who are doing the tapping with you to get to lots of different areas on that stem and remove the likelihood or reduce the likelihood you're going to hit stained wood. Question from Mike Recklin: do you recommend marking tap holes so you can find them in future years? Well, Mike, that would be good to do. A lot of folks who are certified organic are not allowed to use paint. I suppose you could use something other than paint that would be acceptable to the organic certifiers, but I would want to check to make sure that you're not putting yourself at risk for being kicked out of the program or receiving some other sanction for doing that. So I do think that it's a good idea to somehow keep track, but understanding how to do that, perhaps there's a way to mark that tap hole in another way that doesn't involve paint. Looks like Bert asked a question: does tapping at an angle impact speed and extent of compartmentalization? So if I understand your question correctly, Bert, are you asking whether or not the angle of how you put the tap hole into the tree, does that impact the compartmentalization? And my understanding is no, it doesn't. We have looked at angle of the tap hole in terms of yield and have found no difference. I see no reason why the angle would impact the amount of compartmentalization or the speed by which the tree compartmentalizes. So no, I don't think it would. There's a question from Keith, or a statement who says, I pattern tap up or down 6 or 8 inches and over 1 or 2. I may worry if I do not hit stained wood occasionally that I'm moving too far sideways between years. How much unstained wood is logical to leave between tap holes? Well, I mean, Keith, I think when I found that I tapped into a tree just directly above an old tap hole and didn't hit stained wood, it certainly gave me pause. The staining can be quite variable. So I know a lot of people do pattern tapping. I generally don't recommend it, just because I think I think it certainly works for a period of time, better longer if you have nice clean trees that haven't been tapped. I do worry a little bit that the pattern allows people to just focus on that measurement and then not look at the whole tree. I would definitely recommend looking at the entire tree, because there are other defects that can impact whether or not a tap hole is conductive. So if you have an old branch stub or have some other issue, if you're not paying attention to the whole tree, you might end up hitting that as well. So I guess I don't have a particular number to tell you, other than if you looked at that picture I showed early on, looking at wall number 3, you see the staining, the non-conductive wood really doesn't extend very far from side to side. So chances are that 2 inches is more than enough for sure. And I see a question from Mark Morin. Did you try the impact of tapping right over old tap hole, but after 2 inches of new wood? New tap in not stained wood, but really near. I'm not totally sure if I understand your question, Mark. The treatment that we did, was really just 1 inch above an existing, a previous tap hole. So maybe what you're asking is, have you tried tapping over an old tap hole, but after there's been 2 inches of growth? It just wasn't part of this particular project. In theory, if your tap hole is no deeper than 2 inches and you've accumulated more than 2 inches of growth, it should be largely as productive as a new fresh tap hole, I would think, for sure. Oh, thanks for clarifying that I got it right. Well, that appears to be all the questions in the chat. Everyone should have the ability to, oh, looks like people are muted, but if they want to ask a question, you're more than welcome to. We do have, well, we've got a few minutes anyway. Any questions from the group? So no questions from the group. I see folks are unmuted, but.
I have a question.
Okay. Is this Paul?
Yes.
All right.
If you drill a hole and you get brown wood almost entirely, would it make sense to move around and drill again, even if the tree would not otherwise support 2 taps?
Yeah, so that question comes up quite a bit, and it is a good one. At what point do you say, well, this is just not productive, I need to do a new hole? I would say if it's almost all brown, yes, I would say there's probably something else going on. It could just be a goof, and there was a tap hole right there, and you didn't see it right off, but when you look back, maybe there's some snow on the tree or who knows what. But it could also be that there's some other issues with that tree. And I would say before you go and drill a new hole, take that time, look at the whole stem, look at up and down, and try to figure out what's going on. If it was just a simple explanation of I just wasn't paying attention and I hit an old tap hole that was right there, go ahead and make a new one. If it's the tree is really in bad shape for some reason, then you might just want to identify that tree as having some other issues, and maybe it's taking up growing space that could be better used for some other trees that are in better shape and ready to occupy more of the canopy. Unfortunately, I'm not going to give you it's 80% brown, yes, new tap hole, but 75, no, hold on. That's a tough one. That's kind of on an individual basis, I would say, as far as when you'd make that decision to do that second hole.
Would you put a tap in that first hole?
No, the tree is going to be as good as anything to make that, what little bit of conductive wood that's there, seal off. So I don't think you're really going to run the risk of having a tree becoming severely impacted if you leave it open.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I have a question.
All right.
Did you see any big amount less production if you did tap below the lateral line?
So I took out one of the slides that I've used before. We do have a whole presentation on tapping below the lateral line. When we did that work, we saw no difference in yields when tapping below the lateral line, but there were several treatments, and there's a fair amount of detail in terms of the experimental setup, but the basics are, if you have a good vacuum tubing system, you're careful, you are not going to see a big reduction or really any by tapping below the lateral line. It's not designed for gravity tubing systems, that practice. We don't necessarily recommend that, but if you send me an email, I can point you to a more complete presentation about that topic.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So any other questions that people may have? I see in the chat that, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Mark. Not a question, just a comment. This was good stuff. I appreciate you doing this presentation late in the day. Got a lot out of it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Bert. I was going to say that I saw a note from Tom in the chat that my video was a little bit glitchy at the beginning. I apologize if you didn't get a clear presentation. I certainly will. If there was an issue and you didn't get it all, we'll try to remedy that before we post the video on our on the webinar page. Anyone want to have any other questions that you have about the process?
I've got a physiology question, Mark. Is it on wall 2 and wall 3, is it your understanding that it's a physical barrier of the rays and the summerwood, or is it a production of phenols that in those areas that are actually inhibiting the growth of the microbes?
I think it's a combination of the anatomy, just the way it's structured, how it's oriented, those cells. So that's a physical, and then also the chemical barriers, like you mentioned, that the tree actively produces and wouldn't otherwise produce at that location unless there had been a wound. So it's really a combination.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to point out is that, and it goes along with the question about pattern tapping and sort of how do you avoid hitting stained wood. There is so much variability in this process. You know, individual trees, even within sugar maple, some individuals are just inherently better at compartmentalizing. And that kind of points to a genetic component that some individuals are just going to be better than others. And that kind of makes setting a hard and fast number difficult, because some work that Abby has done has identified that it can be dramatically different. You know, you can have a relatively small stain above and below, or you can have a very large one. And I think that's it's interesting. It can also be a little bit maddening when you're trying to come up with a neat and tidy recommendation to do in the woods when there's lots of other pressures, like the sap is running and it's time to make syrup. So, any other questions before we go? Well, I really appreciate everyone tuning in for this and your questions, and please tune in again. You know, we're going to have some other great webinars later in the 2 weeks from now and on into December. I certainly encourage you to check out the past presentations. There's a lot of resources both on the Maple Manager, but also on the UVM Extension Maple page and the Proctor Maple Research Center, especially on the YouTube channel that Proctor has. If you have any questions, definitely send us those questions, and I hope everyone is doing well out there, and it's nice to be able to talk about something as fun as trees and sugaring. So take care.